Yep. So welcome everyone. Thanks for having us. And we are here. So who's here today is David Kessler, who is the co-owner and president of Legism, and then me from Spherity, based in Germany. And we both are here to represent the Open Credentialing Initiative. And what that's all about, you're going to hear in this presentation. So we're going to give you, well, I start by giving you an introduction to the US Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which is the background of what OCI is all about. Then I talk specifically about OCI, give you an idea of the work we do and who we are. And then David is going to take over and talk about credentialing in general and how OCI uses it. Right. So you might have heard of the US Drug Supply Chain Security Act before. It passed Congress in 2013 and had sort of a 10-year time frame. So it's coming into full force fall next year. And this is why now the pharmaceutical industry is basically scrambling to fix the last issues and plug the last holes. And this is where OCI is helping. Bit of background on what this DSCSA is all about. Basically, it wants to protect patients better by improving the pharma supply chain, which is awfully complex. As you can see, manufacturers deal with wholesalers and wholesalers deal with wholesalers, and then everyone deals with dispensers. And in the end, somehow drugs end up in patients' hands. So the DSCSA covers basically regulations from manufacturer down to dispensers. And the goals, the three main goals are basically to prevent harmful drugs from entering the supply chain. So harmful being, like fake drugs, tampered ones and whatnot. Then detect harmful drugs that have managed to enter the supply chain. And finally, once they've been found, respond rapidly to take them off. There are 4 key requirements that the DSCSA has defined. These apply to the main sort of trading partners, as they're called, supply chain actors in the pharma supply chain. These are the manufacturers, repackagers, the distributors, and dispensers, which are like clinics and pharmacies, and they all have their own definition in the legal text as well. And these 4 requirements are that everyone in that chain must be an authorized trading partner, which means they have specified licenses that authorize them to handle drugs. Product verifications must take place. So for example, if in the warehouse there's like a dodgy box, maybe it says like Johnson & Johnson on it, but that company rarely deals with Johnson & Johnson, or the logo looks a bit shifty, then they're supposed to check whether this box is legit. And these 2 top squares are basically where OCI comes in, and David is going to tell you much more about this. So I'm not going to go into any detail. The other 2 requirements are product tracing and serialization. So product tracing is basically that on handover of drugs from one supply chain actor to the next, the history of that drug must be known and transferred to the next owner of the box of drugs, basically. And serialization has taken up loads of time in the last few years in the pharma industry. It's all about barcoding down to the package level, not just batches, so that you can literally trace everything that goes through the supply chain. Right. So the more like new challenge within that the DSCSA has created is that indirect trading partners needs to be vetted. So you see sort of on the left side, you have like the manufacturer, distributor, and the clinic, and the vetting, each single step in that chain is fairly simple because you have a direct relationship. So you have somehow done your know your customer or know your supplier due diligence. But now if the dispenser has to check with the manufacturer This is a problem because they might have never dealt with the manufacturer because they've always used the wholesaler in between. And then how can you trust that somebody who says I'm Johnson & Johnson really comes from that company? And if you want to do this now manually, it can take days or even weeks. And what the new way that we propose, and that's also sort of recommended by the FDA, is to do this all electronically, so that it can basically be done within the blink of an eye. And yeah, this is still a huge challenge. This is like, I mean, it might sound trivial to outsiders, but this is in such a complex supply chain, knowing indirect interactions is really a challenge. But David's going to tell you more about how OCI has tackled that with credentialing. So now to general. So hang on, any questions at this point? I take this as a no.
I don't think so. I haven't seen anything in the chat either, so I think you're good to keep going.
Okay. By the way, do you get background noise from me?
No, you sound clear on my end.
Okay, good. Yeah. Right, then let's dive into a general intro to OCI. So OCI is the Open Credentialing Initiative, and it's an open ecosystem that supports the pharmaceutical industry, as I've already alluded to, with DSCSA requirements. The goal is to enable this compliance by 2023. And there are industry-wide pilots and discussion rounds and all that. And even though it says here only mentions the DSCSA requirements, we are also starting to look beyond DSCSA. So what OCI does is basically, it's like, imagine it as almost like consortium. It's a gathering of companies from across the pharma supply chain and service providers like Spherity and Legism, for example. And we come together and we don't build software as such within OCI. That's the job of the individual companies, the service providers. But what we do is we discuss and develop the architecture that the software is supposed to be based on. And everyone who joins OCI commits to complying with this architecture and the compliance criteria and everything that we define within that gathering. And the huge benefit that comes out of this is interoperability, because if everyone plays by the same rule book, then obviously processes between us will run smoother. And we also use standards, global standards based on issued by GS1, for example, or the W3C. And what comes out of OCI then helps automation, which increases efficiency by in the supply chain actor systems. It supports the due diligence, and overall, because of the way credentialing works, there's security by design implied in it, and the conclusion of all of this, like applying this technology and the architecture, is that you can basically trust that proof that is being transmitted through the software implementations of the architecture. So some of this I think I've already mentioned. So we're a consortium or an incubator of credentialing solutions. By the way, credentialing is also going to be explained by David later. We work across the industry. We develop conformance criteria so that everything is interoperable. And I don't need to read everything out here, but basically everything we do is going to be published. We're like, we communicate openly. There's GitHub, there's the website with more resources, and really even though the OCI membership is fairly defined, that people can join anytime, we also welcome input from outside. This is why we have a GitHub, for example. We already work with quite a few organizations. For example, the HDA, which is a key organization for dispensers, GS1, PG, and so on. Also FDA, we have chats there. Now, where does this wonderful gathering of companies come from? Basically, OCI was born out of a pilot. So the industry had realized this whole authorized trading partner challenge hadn't been solved yet. So a few companies came together, including Spherity and Legism, to trial a solution based on credentialing. And that pilot concluded successfully in Feb 22. And then in April, to keep this momentum going and build on the success, OCI was launched as an incubator underneath the Center for Supply Chain Studies. Yeah, and from then on, all the things happened that I just explained before. So OCI is sort of slowly growing up, and we're getting more and more structure in this organization. So we have a steering committee. David is one of the members and one of the chairs of this committee, and then there are two more chairs. We've also got a facilitator on top of that who keeps sort of everything together. And then we have a bit of management going on, especially sort of the marketing communications, which is where I'm a co-chair together with someone else. And then we have some admin tasks to deal with as well. And then more interesting probably for people from the outside are the sort of non-committal engagements. So we have external advisors when we need them. There are open calls that have just launched. One is an industry alignment call to allow input from trading partners to feedback on all the things that we do, because in the end, it's the trading partners, so the supply chain actors, who will be using the solutions based on OCI's recommendations. And then there are innovation sessions that look at use cases for credentialing and OCI architecture beyond DSCSA. And out of these innovation sessions, pretty much emerging initiatives are born. And at the moment, we have just kicked off the KYC, KYS initiative. And yeah, and an initiative would then grow up if taken seriously and found worthwhile, it would grow up and become a program. And this is the moment the DSCSA program is the only one we're running just now. And then each program again has its own steering committee and P&A committee. So we're really trying to keep that organized and have proper processes in place. Yes, so the current ecosystem is quite varied, as you see, different actors across the pharma sector and some big players in as well. So that's always quite good to have that sort of backup from the big names. And it's useful, I mean, it's needed as well for DSCSA. You need the influential companies to sort of pull everyone with them.
Chris, would you mind if I mention just a couple things on that last slide?
Sure.
Great. Just one point of clarification. There was a slide earlier that had the timelines on it, and I think those were misrepresented. They're showing 2022 for OCI, but actually OCI started in 2021, beginning of the year. And so I think those are just a little off, but we'll get those corrected. Apologies for the confusion there. But yeah, then on the ecosystem itself, the nice thing here, these just to kind of further explain the DSCSA components, because it does involve obviously the trading partners represented there on the left with those different companies. There are about 70,000 different trading partners represented in those categories of manufacturers, wholesalers, dispensers. That number could be plus minus a little bit depending on how you classify certain trading partners out there, but those would all be part of that list. And then you can see as part of OCI currently, like Chris was explaining, those big names are part of not only the trading partners that are participating, but also some of the early adopters that want to test out what the different service providers have stepped up and produced so far that match up with the OCI standards. And so that would be, what those different integrators are doing there. Those are pretty much represented with a VRS type application, meaning a verification routing service, different issuers represented there on the right, wallet providers, and then other organizations like standard bodies and industry organizations like HDA and GS1. So that's what those kind of components are separated out into to kind of make up that ecosystem. And as Chris said earlier, it is an open invitation for folks to be a part of this, contribute to it. And so as we see more and more adopt this process in the early adopter program, as well as more trading partners join, obviously this list will grow, but just to kind of further explain what these different components represent. Thanks, Chris.
Good, thank you. Right, roadmap. Yeah, so like I say, we're not done yet. We are, so the credentialing service is pretty much in place. There's, just see, this is an old slide. There's not only Spherity Ledgers, and there's also XATP, for example, as another wallet provider. So it's not like we said, an open ecosystem. So there's also, competitors basically, joining in to the effort, because just to give trading partners also a choice. I mean, that's the whole idea of OCI, create this interoperability, so then customers have a choice of providers pretty much. Then VRS testing, David just mentioned that. I wasn't going to go too much into this. It's basically another service provider that helps routing those messages that you have to check where does this box of drugs come from. So these messages have to be routed to the manufacturer, and VRS do this sort of messaging on behalf of the pharmacy or whoever needs to inquire. So there's a huge testing effort coming up this summer. And yeah, we're also looking at the dispenser pilot, for example, because for now we've more focused on the other parts of the supply chain, and there's a few more things coming here. For example, towards the end it says order to cash and drop shipments. This is more than other use cases outside of DSCSA. And with that, I'll hand over to David.
Great, thanks, Chris. So just wanted to kind of run through some basic principles around credentials, in this case, verifiable credentials. So maybe bear with me as I kind of get everyone on the same page. Some of this might be known, some of the information might be new, but as we speak towards verifiable credentials and then how they're used, it's good to have a little context of what makes them up, why they're important, and so forth. So let's go to the first slide, please, Chris. Great. So earlier, Chris alluded to, there being a level of trust that's associated with verifiable credentials. And so basically what we're trying to do is establish, how we can, trust this process. And so one way of looking at this would be to start out by, establishing a trust triangle. So there's an issuer. That issuer has a number of different processes and procedures for collecting information, verifying information, and then based on the results of that process, decide whether or not a credential can be issued. And so in this case, it would be an anchored credential, anchored on, say, a blockchain. And I'll go into a little more detail on that in a bit, but that credential is then issued by the issuer to the holder. So that is the company, let's say, or the person that has requested that credential to be issued to them. So now they hold it and they can utilize that, say, from the standpoint of holding it in a digital wallet, and then they now have it in their possession to do something with it. So now they can present that that credential to another company. Again, going back to the concept of what Chris talked about earlier in those indirect relationships. So now that holder says, this is who I am, and they can present that credential to another company that can then verify it. And they can verify it in a couple ways. They can verify that it was actually issued by an issuer, and they can verify that it hasn't been tampered with or changed in some way. And so that's the idea of a verifiable credential, not just, here is some paperwork, but here is something that's electronic. You can trust what's within it, and it can be verified to know that what's within it hasn't been changed, and it has been put together and represented by a trusted issuer. So that's kind of the building block of this trust triangle of what we're trying to establish. So let's go to the next level here of actually establishing the credential. So if you look at this slide, there's a few other pieces that we want to kind of highlight here. So the first thing is we need to establish a unique ID. In this case, it's a DID, or decentralized identifier, which is going to uniquely identify this verifiable credential. And so down in that example there, you see the scheme being a DID scheme, so a decentralized identifier, a method, and we'll see later that this one method would be, say, anchoring it on Ethereum blockchain, and then a unique ID that is very specific to this particular credential. And what it does is it resolves to, or results in, a DID document. And in that DID document, there's some more information like a public key and things that are used in order to cryptographically verify that, this is a good credential, that it hasn't been changed by anybody. So there's information in that DID document that is used in the verification process. And then also that DID, that decentralized identifier, is contained or embedded within the verifiable credential, along with a number of other data elements. But this is really what's establishing its uniqueness as a verifiable credential, or VC. So that, and as we look at an example later in the presentation, you'll be able to see the different data elements or claims that are associated with that verifiable credential. But then that VC is also embedded within the verifiable presentation. And that's what is actually shared between different trading partners, let's say, as they make a request and a response. So there'll be a verifiable presentation. And part of the value of that presentation is you could actually limit the data elements from the verifiable credential that would be presented or contained within that VP, that verifiable presentation. And we're using, at least in our OCI processing for DSCSA, we're using GS1's lightweight messaging standard in order to build out that verifiable presentation. So part of that JSON request. So basically all of that is trying to get everyone kind of up to speed on the idea of that decentralized identifier, that unique ID. It's resolving to a DID document that has additional information that's used as part of the verification process. Our verifiable credential that is associated with that verifiable credential. Sorry, I was reading a question there that just popped up. I'll answer it in a second. The verifiable credential, which contains that DID, and then the verifiable credential that's utilized in that verifiable presentation, either all of it or parts of it, in order to build out what's actually being exchanged in the request and response. So we did have a question that comes into the chat, and you're welcome to speak up and ask questions, or put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to keep up with it all. But that DID is issued typically by, in our example, the digital wallet is generating it. It could be issued by the issuer themselves, and then put into the credential that's associated with the digital wallet that's holding that credential. But basically it's being issued at the time of creation of the identity. And there's actually multiple credentials that could be issued to one particular identity, because those credentials could be used for different purposes. So as we go through the presentation, I'll speak to proving identity. So that's the idea of knowing who we're talking to in these indirect relationships, right? We know without a doubt that this company is the company that we expect it to be. And they're represented by that identity credential. But then we can also have other credentials that are created that might make other claims. So we're going to touch on authorized trading partner status, which is a different type of a verifiable credential that's issued. And then there'll be a link between that original DID, that decentralized identity, and then all of the other credentials that might be associated with that original identity credential that has that DID associated with it. So, okay, Chris, let's go on. Hopefully I answered that question okay. So digging in a little bit deeper, so we'll talk a little bit more about the principles that make up these verifiable credentials. So again, starting on the left-hand side, you'll see the credential there. You'll see that it contains the DID, the scheme being the DID itself, the decentralized identifier, the method, in this case, the example of using Ethereum blockchain to anchor it, and then the identifier. And you can see that that DID is inside all of the data elements for that verifiable credential. So we build a schema for a verifiable credential. In this case, this is showing the identity credential. But again, there could be other credentials that are also put into the same digital wallet that's associated with this identity. But this identity now has credential ID, the issuer DID, other information about the subject. So these are the claims. So it could be the name, their address, their location. If it's a different type of identity, maybe on a person, it's their name, it's their date of birth. So a lot of things could be associated with these credentials and established as claims. And those claims have all been proven by the issuer, because again, we want to establish that trust that this verifiable credential can be trusted. It is who they say it is representing, and then all those claims that would also be associated with it. And so inside, if you continue to move over towards the right-hand side of the slide, inside that credential, there's additional information that's very helpful. So there's information about the issuer. So where can I go to get information, that DID document that's associated with the issuer, saying the trading partner or the subject. We use trading partner because we're talking in this case about different industry trading partners, but whatever the subject's, the holder's DID document would be there, and that can be verified. And then there's two important concepts about each one of these verifiable credentials that is worth really honing in on. And that's the idea that these credentials have a expiration date, and they also have a revocation registry that's associated with them. So let's say you produce a verifiable credential that's good for 2 years. So you're going to see out there that, okay, we've gone through as an issuer, we've vetted that information, we can establish these claims, we've issued this credential, and it's good for, let's say, 2 years. Now, as part of that issuance, the issuer also has the responsibility to keep up with, has anything changed during the period of time that this credential is good for before it expires? If so, then how can I pull back or revoke this credential? And so let's take, for example, a credential that might be issued over a license. And so that is one of the things that Chris talked about earlier in the presentation. There's that ATP, authorized trading partner. That authorized trading partner is established for, say, a pharmacy based on their board of pharmacy license. Well, if that board of pharmacy license is issued for a period of 2 years, and we can therefore issue this credential for, say, a period of 2 years, what happens during those 2 years if that particular license goes from an active status to an inactive status? The issuer is monitoring that and then says, oh, because we have now changed status from active to inactive, we have to be able to tell the people that are utilizing these credentials that we have now revoked this credential. And so within the credential itself, there is a location, a process that's noted to say, where can you go see if it's revoked? And so there's a number of ways that you could develop a revocation status or process. We happen to use in OCI currently, the method is an LDAP process. So basically it builds a list. You can check that list. If that list contains the identity of this credential on it, then you know it's revoked. If it's not on that list, then you know that it hasn't been revoked. And so therefore, if the issue or the expiration date hasn't come yet, and it's not on that list, you know this is still a valid credential. So these are all essential elements or pieces of information that are associated with the verifiable credentials, so that as you're utilizing them, as you're processing them, again, you can make sure that they came from an issuer that you trust, that they haven't been tampered with or changed the contents of that verifiable credential, and that the expiration is still good and hasn't been revoked. So therefore, again, you can have complete trust in the information that's contained in this verifiable credential. Okay, let's keep moving on. So there are other organizations, some of the listed here, that are using these W3C standard verifiable credentials. So just worth noting that besides OCI and our ecosystem of trading partners, service providers, and others, here are some other companies and organizations out there that are using these as well. So let's dig in a little bit to how OCI has developed this and how we're using verifiable credentials in the process. So authorized trading partner, worth covering one more time. So an authorized trading partner, by definition of DSCSA, you have to check certain information from manufacturers, wholesalers, dispensers, and so forth. So there is a registration process through the FDA that manufacturers have to utilize. For, say, a wholesaler, there's also a board of pharmacy license that they have to get to be a distributor for a particular state. There's also a requirement to register with the FDA. For dispensers, say a pharmacy, clinic, hospital, they also have to have certain licenses issued by the Board of Pharmacy. And so what an issuer is doing to establish authorized trading partner status is making sure that those correct registrations and licenses are in place. If they're in place, then there is a particular schema that the issuer can now issue that verifiable credential against, or in that format, in order to be utilized in the ecosystem. Okay. So in order to deal with an authorized trading partner credential, we said, okay, there are rules out there. We follow those rules. We check those licenses and we issue that credential. But as Chris and I have both mentioned earlier, we have to know who we're actually dealing with. So we have to make sure that they are who they say they are as a trading partner. And so we needed to very quickly establish their identity. And so we came up with a process in the pilot, and then that process is continued on with the actual OCI formation of that ecosystem. And we said, okay, what are the methods that we could identify somebody by? And so if you look on the far left-hand side of this slide, this is what an issuer would do in order to start proving someone's identity. There's actually a process that the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, uses in order to prove identity. And so we can actually utilize a X509 certificate that the DEA issues in order to prove identity. We could use corporate documents that could be collected in order to prove identity. And then there's a number of other methods that we've now established against a NIST level 2 assurance guidance that we could also collect in order to prove identity. But basically what you need to do is have some level of certainty that you've collected the right information, gone through the right processes to produce the identity. And so that's really the start of the verifiable trust that we can establish through the process of proving identity. And then there in the middle, we see acquiring the ATP credential. So now we know who we're dealing with. So we can move on to proving that they are an authorized trading partner, collecting the right information, again, of licensing and registration, and then using that ATP credential within the verification, response, and request process, which is there noted on the far right. And so this is kind of the process flow of getting that identity credential, establishing who they are, then getting the ATP credential, making sure that they have the correct licensing and registration, and then utilizing that ATP credential within the ecosystem for that, let's say, PI verification and response. That's product information. Okay, Chris. So we've established authorized trading partner, and now we're going to look at an example of the verification. So thinking about a product verification or PI verification for that product information, we'll start there at the top and just looking at this ATP credential that the credential issuer there in step 1 has issued to a digital wallet for both the requester, maybe say a pharmacy, and then also on the right side, the manufacturer. And so now within the requester digital wallet and the manufacturer digital wallet, they have their identity credential, they have their ATP credential. They might also hold other credentials, but for a PI verification, there is a request that is submitted by, say, the pharmacy, and and this is through that VRS process that we kind of alluded to, over to the manufacturer to get a response back. So the requester makes the request, the response then comes from the manufacturer to identify that that product. Okay, Chris. So in order for that PI verification to take place, we have to make sure that we're all working off the same set of rules, right? So we have to make sure that we have interoperability between the different players within the ecosystem. And we mentioned those earlier, those trading partners, those big pharma manufacturers, those wholesalers, those dispensers. Those are all examples of trading partners. The integrators or solution providers that might be part of this. So the VRS or verification routing service that would be part of the ecosystem. And then those credential issuers and wallet providers. And as you can tell, there's multiple service providers, multiple trading partners. And so in order to make sure that there is interoperability between all these different players, we took the approach of developing conformance criteria, basically policies that everyone would play by. And so there is a conformance criteria for an issuer, for digital wallet providers. We're working towards now finalizing the conformance criteria for the VRS and the trading partners throughout the industry, so that everybody can work together in order to make sure that the ecosystem is working interoperably. So, kind of in closing here and wrapping up, we wanted to find a way to promote the solution to the industry. So within OCI, we came up with certain elements in order to do that. So we do hold calls throughout the week. Those different groups that Chris talked to earlier, the steering committees, the policy and architecture groups. So each week, those different groups get together. And then we further that by allowing that early adopter program, basically test driving the solution. So we have methods for the trading partners to go out and get registered, methods for them to join OCI or participate by listening and providing feedback. We have the GitHub that Chris also talked about earlier. And then, we continue to promote this solution and this ecosystem throughout the industry with other types of industry events and things like that. So I'll kind of pause there. I think I've addressed the questions that came in, but if there's anything else, we can open it up now. We've got about 10 minutes left. So thank you all for this time.
Does anybody have any questions out there? No, I thought there'd be some questions. Actually, I have a few questions. Yeah, so you seem to go into some of the technical parts. So like the more deeper technical details, is that all on GitHub then? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. All the technical guidance would be documented on GitHub. So we have it kind of at a user level, and then also at a technical level. There is also within OCI, there's an information page as well as a document that maps all of the different resources to different concepts. So whether it's a technical schema, whether it's more user-based information, or just explaining, what a verifiable credential is. So there's quite a bit of information that is documented on the OCI website as well as on GitHub.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I see that Chris just put a link in there for resources.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, because I think that would be really helpful for like a company, because the tech people are the ones that are going to be making everything work. And then, but you need everybody to understand up front, which is, well, you guys are doing a great job of letting us learn about that part. But I know it is going to be a little complicated in the background, and especially since there's different like blockchain networks that you do support.
Right.
But so it's really interesting when you were showing the identifier, and you can put in like a different type of network.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So are you then supporting like permissioned and public and like, Hyperledger Fabric versus like Ethereum and different other, blockchain network?
Yeah, so right now we've limited our method to either a did web or did Ethereum anchoring. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a lot of technical talk about, other methods to expand into. And so I'm probably not the individual to comment on it, but I know that that the more technical folks, especially at Sparity and other organizations, have looked into that. And so I think we can probably provide additional, insights on that. But I know right now, just to get everything launched, because we do have a pretty short window of time between now and November 2023, we've really focused just on those two methods. Obviously, we needed it to be on blockchain, but then we also had a did web method as well.
Okay, thanks.
Although, I mean, you need to remember, like, blockchain is a really small part here. Like, OCI isn't one of those consortia or organizations that says, blockchain solves all your problems. Like, we really just need the blockchain to anchor the DID. And that's it. There's no other hashed messages or whatever information anchored. That's why I'm not sure. I'm also not technical there, but I'm not sure we need another method, to be honest.
Yeah, and Christine, I think one of the things that we focused on was, and you kind of alluded to it, that there's so much kind of technical things in the background that have to happen. And you're right, those are the solution providers that have to have those resources. They have to know how it's being developed in order to build out the solution sets. But we were also trying to keep it as simple as possible on those industry trading partners, right? So when you look at a manufacturer or a wholesaler, particularly the larger ones, they have incredible technical staffs, right? That some of this they could build on their own, and that's part of the idea between the open stack information, that they could go out and get that technical information, and if they wanted to try to build their own verifiable credentials and become an issuer and try to have their own digital wallet, I mean, those things are all possible and documented out there. However, you look at a pharmacy, a clinic, maybe a small hospital, those resources wouldn't be available there. So we had to make sure that the solution providers had all the resources they needed to build out the solution set, while still keeping the onboarding and the usage very, very simple for those 70,000 trading partners throughout the industry. And so it is a one-time onboarding that those trading partners do, and then the solution providers basically are able to take it over and manage it from there.
Yeah, and they're basically just getting the data in a certain format.
That's right. That's right. And then they're
yeah, so it's really not, at some point it's really not even network specific, but that's what's, I guess, in place to prove the like the trust and the security of the system that you're getting the data from.
That's right. So there's a heavy technical lift on the service providers, but very minimal to no technical lift for those trading partners, right? They're basically configuring their systems, their ERP systems, their VRS systems, in order to say, how do I make these requests or these responses based on the credentialing and the verifiable presentation that I'm getting.
Interesting.
So I think sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just going to see if anybody else had any more questions. So continue, Chris.
One take-home message from this, aside from all the tech stuff, I think is the fact that OCI has come into existence. Like Spherity and Legism have partnered to provide a solution within or based on Spherity, based on OCI's architecture. And we could have just walked into, or we could have tried to walk into the pharmaceutical industry and say, like, look, here it is, and then be isolated. So I think it's just a good lesson how to actually break into an industry by forming something like a consortium or this sort of grouping where everyone works towards a common goal for their own motivations, and everyone chips in with.
Yes, we will. Oh. So I guess we will. I think we got everything up until like through the first questions or two, but for in terms of recording. So anyway, so I think unless you guys have anything else to share, are you? What are the plans for OCI then? Or do you have any other talks coming up, or any big
yeah. So we do have I think it's either two or three different Fridays during the month. We're doing some additional education sessions. And so we post those sessions on our OCI website. People can join those. Yeah, there's some events that Chris, thank you, Chris, just put in the chat. So there's some continued education sessions there. They're for innovations like other uses for verifiable credentials, things about the actual progress that we're making with OCI. Right now, we're pretty heavily focused on the upcoming 2023 date, obviously to get the industry prepared for that. But yeah, then we will continue past that date with the different idea of use cases for verifiable credentials.
So what happens if a company doesn't meet the 2023 date? Does anybody know yet?
That's a good question, right? And so it does come down to FDA enforcement. That's where the rules are there. Are they going to enforce it? What are the enforcement's going to look like? So those are all things that the agency keeps very close, right? So there's information they share. There's things that they don't necessarily share, but that is something that people are positioning towards, right? So what happens? What if I don't make this step in time? Am I putting my company at risk? There are also some manual processes that can be done, for certain use cases within DSCSA. So would it still be acceptable for some companies to, let's say for sellable returns, to make a manual request for that versus going through this automation process? But again, the call out, how most lawyers are looking at it, it's saying you need to have an electronic process for these requirements. And so we'll just have to see what the FDA decides to do if people don't all get on board.
Yeah, I'd be afraid if I was not doing all this diligent work right now, like for some of the
Right.
companies out there. So it's really good what you guys are doing it and trying to help as much as you can to make it easier, because it is going to be a lot of work, and it's but it needs to be done. So it's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and giving your presentation. I really learned a lot. I think everyone else did too. And thanks for the links to your events and the resource and stuff. I think I'm going to dive into some of those documents in GitHub. I'm really curious to see some of those little details. Just because it's
Sure.
With all the blockchain like technical stuff, it's just really interesting to see all that.
Excellent.
And see what you guys
thank
have.
you for the opportunity today. Appreciate it.
And so I think we can close up. See who else is still here.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Okay, and thanks, Rami, for setting up the link for everyone.
No worries. Thanks all.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you,
Chris.
bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.